This video is going to look at how we choose a statistical test, and most people think that potentially just pull it out of a hat, anyone will do, but there is a step-by-step process you've got to follow in one of these questions. So if we look at your specification, there are key things you've got to know. You've got to know what factors affect choosing a statistical test. So what are the levels of measurement, what's the experimental design. You've also got to know when to use these different tests, so in Spearman's Row, Pearson's R, Wilcoxon's, Mann-Whitney, the related t-test, unrelated t-test, chi-square test. There's a lot you've got to know. Okay, and I'm going to try and teach you a quick way of remembering this and what you actually have to know for the exam. Because if you look in some textbooks, then they're giving you how to carry out the whole Spearman's Row or Pearson's R or Wilcoxon test and all the equations you've got to use. You're not going to ever be tested on that. Okay, what you will be tested on is when you might be asked, when will you use these particular ones? Here's a set of data, what test would you use and why? And that's what you've got to know. So don't be scared when you look in a textbook about, I don't know any of these equations. You won't need to know them. The only one you've got to be able to conduct is a sign test, which you would have done in AS. So a lot of people always ask, why do we actually need to know this? Well, statistical tests are used to determine whether there is a significant difference or if there's a correlation between two sets of data. So you conduct your experiment, you put all your data through a statistical test, and it tells you whether there is a difference between your experimental condition and your control condition. And this lets you know whether or not you should be accepting your null hypothesis or your experimental hypothesis. And also, it's in your spec. So whether you like it or not, you've got to learn this particular topic and how to answer the questions. So we're going to look at 3 different steps when you get one of these questions. Firstly, you've got to know whether the experiment is looking for a difference or a correlation. So is it a correlation study or is it an experiment? 2, what is the experimental design? And 3, what is the level of measurement in the study you've been given? So we're going to go through these 3 steps. By the end of it, you should know which test to be picking when. So first step, is it an experiment or is it a correlation? This should be clear from the little stem that they give you. They'll tell you all about the experiment at the start, and they will also most likely give you a hypothesis, or they'll ask you to write one. And it should be clear from that whether you've got an experiment or a correlation. So you must know that straight away. Then you've got to know the experimental design. So you should remember this from AS. You've got independent groups where participants just complete one of the conditions. And then you've got repeated measures and matched pairs where they complete both conditions. And for the sake of all of this, repeated measures and matched pairs are the same thing. Whether it's a repeated measures test or matched pairs test, they use the same statistical tests. Okay, so for the sake of this, you just need to know they're the same thing. Step 3, you've got to know about levels of measurement. Well, if you ever see the word level of measurement, it just means what type of data does the study produce? Is it ordinal, nominal, or interval? And we'll go through what these 3 are, just to give you a reminder. Ordinal data is any data that can be ordered or ranked. So it's the data that you can count or put in order. So it might be house number or swimming personal best, how fast you swim 100 meters. Or it might be on a scale of from 1 dislike to 5 being like. There's a few examples at the bottom here. If I got everyone in the class to rank how much they enjoyed psychology, then from 1 to 5, we'd get a range, and I could put that in order. Okay, I could get that number and I could put it into an order. Nominal data then is slightly different. This is data that we can count, but we can't order it. So it might be, what sex are you? Are you male or female? We can know how many people there are, but we put you into a category. Okay, you put into one or the other. What colour are your eyes? They're going to be green, brown, blue. Okay, you're going to fall into a category. And sometimes you might use a code 0 or 1, or you'll get them to tick off whether they're male or female to identify which category they fall into. And this usually occurs in frequencies, or categories as we can call them as well. Finally, you've got interval data. Interval data is Any data you get given with a numerical scale, so if it was time, temperature, weighing scales, there's set intervals on there. And these are intervals of equal measurements. Okay, so the scale has equal intervals. So if you think of minutes, you've got 60 seconds, next minute, 60 seconds, next minute, 60 seconds. Or it might be the number of words recalled, because you're getting statistical data from that. Okay, you're getting a set number of words that you're going to remember in a memory test, or percentage score in an exam. Okay, there are set intervals. You're going to remember the percentage will be a set number on a scale, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, etc. Words on a number test will go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And this is the most precise form of data because it's based on a numerical scale. So this is the table now with all the different statistical tests you've got to know on it. And somehow we're going to come up with a way of helping you remember this particular table. So if you're in an exam and they ask you what statistical test comes up, you're going to have some way of recalling this table. And using mnemonics is probably the best way of doing that. So you can see here, some of them get used twice. You've got chi-squared comes up twice. Sign test, you should be able to remember from doing last year. So we're going to have a quick look at different ways to remember this. And again, if you look, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 different tests you've got to remember. And be able to, if they give you some data, you just got to go, right, read. Right, I'm going to use Wilcoxon's test. Right, I'm going to use Spearman's row test. You've got to be able to pull that straight out of what they've given you. And there's a few ways to help you remember how to do that. So, how do you actually remember what test to use when? So, I want you to remember a few things. Firstly, I'm really cool. Okay, just remember that. Just the term, I'm really cool. Just keep saying it back to yourself. I'm really cool, I'm really cool, I'm really cool. Next, no cars should crash. So, no cars should crash, no cars should crash. Next, only men wear socks. Only men wear socks. Only men wear socks. And finally, injured unicorns roar painfully. There you go, little unicorn. Injured unicorns roar painfully. So, I'm really cool, no car should crash, only men wear socks, injured unicorns roar painfully. That's all I want you to remember. And if you can remember this, you should be able to remember what statistical tests to use when. So back to this table. So let's have a little bit of a look in more depth of what this table is actually telling us. So down this column here, we've got the levels of measurement, whether it's nominal, ordinal, or interval. And depending on what type of data we're getting, and depending on the experimental design, so whether it was independent measures, repeated measures, or matched pairs, or a correlation, we're going to use a different test. So if it was ordinal data and repeated measures, you go ordinal, repeated measures, you're going to use a Wilcoxon's test to analyze your data. And that's what they're going to want to see from you in an exam. If they give you something with interval data and it's a correlation study, they want to know you know to use the Pearson's R test. But they're not going to tell you what the data is. They're not going to tell you what experimental design is. They expect you to be able to work that out. So that's the first part, working out what type of data is, what experimental design is. And then we go back to our little terms. I'm really cool. So the first part of this table, I, R and C. It's a way of remembering independent groups, repeated measures, correlation. I'm really cool. The next one, you've got no cars should crash. So no cars should crash. Next, only men wear socks. Only men wear socks. Finally, injured unicorns roar painfully. So you're going to have to learn the names of the tests. You're going to have to remember chi-squared, sine test, Mann-Whitney, Wilcoxon. But using these little ways to remind you should help you draw out this table. And I'm going to show you what that would look like if you're in an exam next. So you're in your test, you've read the little experiment, and then they said, right, what statistical tests should the researchers use? And you go back to your little sayings. You write, right, I'm really cool. So you know independent groups, repeated measures, correlation. And you know that it's a repeated measures in this case. And then you remember, no cars should crash. So you know it's repeated measures, you know the data is nominal, so it must be the sine test that I'm going to use. Or you might have ordinal data. So you write out, only men wear socks. Right, it was ordinal data and this was a correlation study in this case. So I'm going to use Spearman's row test. Different question comes up in the exam and now you've got interval data. So injured unicorns roar painfully. Right, it was interval data. It was an independent group study. Right, I'm going to use the unrelated t-test here. So it is about remembering this table. You're only going to have to recall, you're only going to get one of these per paper. So there'll only be one experiment. So you're only going to have to recall one line of it. For example, if it was ordinal data, you're only going to have to recall only men wear socks. That's the only part you're going to have to remember. And then think, right, what was it? It was a repeated measure study or a matched pair study. So I'm going to use Wilcoxon's to analyze it. Okay, so recalling this table could really help you remember what test to use and when. So let's quickly recap. I'm really cool. No car should crash. Only men wear socks. Injured unicorns roar painfully. If you remember these sayings, it should help you to recreate that table and then pull out the correct statistical test when you need it. You'll also read about something called parametric tests. And parametric tests are the most powerful form of test. And they're only used if the data is interval. If you remember, interval data is the most precise because it's based on those specific equal measurements. So we only have parametric tests when the data is interval. And if you remember our table, injured unicorns roar painfully. So the only tests that will be our parametric tests are the unrelated t-test, the related t-test, and Pearson's R. So they're the only three that would be considered parametric or most powerful tests. All other tests in that table are referred to as non-parametric because they're not as powerful. So in a test, you might get 4 marks for selecting the correct test. And you'd be expected to write this up in a set way. So, mention firstly, is it a test of difference or is it a test of association? So is it an experiment or is it a correlation? You would just say, it is a test of difference. It's a test of association. That will get you 1 mark. Next, you mentioned the experimental design. It was conducted using repeated measures. 3rd mark, you mentioned what the data was. The data from the experiment was ordinal, nominal, interval, whichever one it was. Finally, name the test you've selected. And we'll go through loads of these in class to make sure you've got a real understanding of this. And if you want to have a go in past questions from the previous specification, this specification, download them online on AQA's website.